On the day of the earthquake, my husband abandoned me and flew to another city to find his crush. I was buried under the rubble, sending him a message. Henry, there's an earthquake. I'm buried underground, it's so dark. I'm so scared. After being rescued, I sent him 2 more messages before throwing my phone into the ruins. Henry, I can't hold on anymore. It's a good thing you're busy with work. Otherwise you would have died here with me and our child. You being safe is great. It was all intentional on my part. I deliberately wanted him to think I was dead. I deliberately wanted him to repent day and night for me and our unborn child. I want him to cry tears of regret, wishing he had acted differently. When the time comes that I can't hide it anymore, I'll walk up to him and tell him, I want a divorce. The 2nd year of marriage with Henry, his crush returned from abroad. I was the one who went to pick her up with him. I watched as the girl with long black hair, wearing a white dress, and a slender figure, tearfully threw herself into his arms, like a bird returning to its nest. Henry, I finally see you again. And Henry, his body stiffened for a moment. Then he reached out and gently touched her head. There, everything's fine. I stood by their side, feeling like a redundant mistress. After hesitating for a moment, I reached out and grabbed Henry's hand, forcing a smile. Okay, now that she's been picked up, let's go. It was only then that she seemed to notice me for the first time, leaving Henry's embrace. She was smiling, but there was a hint of surprise and unease on her face. Henry, you're married, Henry whispered. The 3 of us then awkwardly made our way back home. Eileen was Henry's crush and also his half-sister. I had always known that Henry had feelings for her, but it was only after we got married that I found out about these things. Henry's family background was somewhat complicated. He was an orphan. His biological parents died in a car accident when he was 9 years old, and after that, a friend of Henry's father, who happens to be Eileen's father, adopted him. Thus, the story of Henry and Eileen finally unfolded. Henry had been a secluded child since he was young, silent, introverted, and exuding an air of keep away from me due to his childhood experiences. Eileen, on the other hand, lived in luxury and happiness, innocent and carefree, like a little sun slowly warming Henry and bringing warmth to their home. Of course, Henry never mentioned anything about his relationship with Eileen to me. But when I led Eileen into our home, where Henry and I had lived together for 3 years, and saw her curiously looking around, touching things here and there, I knew my guess was probably correct. At night, when I was cooking, Henry brought back some beef and onions, asking me to make a steak. He said, Eileen loves steak. I lowered my eyes and remained silent for a while. Henry was not a very attentive person. We had known each other for 8 years, during which I pursued him for 5 years, and we had been living together for 3 years. But even so, he would sometimes forget my preferences. He even forgot that I was allergic to onions. But he remembered Eileen's preferences very clearly, even though she had been abroad for 6 years. I bit my lip and asked, Henry, did you forget? I'm allergic to onions. I get a rash all over my body if I touch them. He seemed dazed for a moment and then smiled, pushing me out of the kitchen. I'm sorry, Haley. I didn't know about your onion allergy. We never have onions on our dining table. Could you wait outside for a while? I'll prepare dinner tonight. In fact, Henry and I had eaten onions once before, 3 years ago, when I had just won him over. That day, my whole being was immersed in joy, and during lunch, he ordered a curry dish, and I unknowingly ate some. It was also the day he took me to the hospital, but it had been too long ago. He probably had forgotten. I nodded quietly without saying a word. Eileen was still in the living room, and I didn't want to make the atmosphere too tense. During dinner, perhaps because of the earlier incident, Henry kept serving me dishes. The shrimp today is quite good. I ate slowly, and when I looked up, I saw Eileen also passing me a shrimp. She glanced at Henry, then at me, with a gentle smile and a natural gesture. Sister, have some more shrimp. Brother's shrimp is the most delicious. It felt as if I were the guest in this house. Eileen stayed with us at home. Bringing her to our home was Henry's idea. 3 days ago, Henry suddenly told me that his sister, who had been living abroad, was returning to the country. He said she had been having a tough time these years, alone abroad, betrayed by her boyfriend, and diagnosed with depression by the doctor. As he spoke, his lips were tight, his eyes deep with a hint of despair. I couldn't help but feel some pity as I looked at him. So, when he said she was coming back alone, didn't want to go home, or let her parents know, and wanted to stay with us for a while, I agreed without hesitation. Back then, I didn't know that his so-called sister was actually his crush for so many years. It wasn't until I saw Eileen's face at the airport that I suddenly realized I had seen her picture before. On Henry's bookshelf, he had her photo tucked in a book. She was the moonlight he had cherished in his heart for years. At night, Thoughts of Henry and Eileen kept me wide awake. Henry held me from behind, his warm breath tickling my ear. Can't sleep, I nodded, then heard a sigh. Stepping out of the room, I found Eileen standing in the living room, tears streaming down her face amid the scattered ceramic pieces on the floor, trembling slightly. The broken pieces on the floor were our ceramic dolls, made by Henry and me at a pottery store. That day, I made his figure, and he made mine. It was only natural for us to get together. I had treasured it as a token of our love, even inscribing Henry and Haley together forever on the base of the doll. But now, it was shattered. I frowned at the scattered ceramic pieces, while Henry's gaze was on Eileen. Eileen looked so beautiful when she cried. Her slightly reddened eyelids invited sympathy from anyone who saw her. It was just a pair of ceramic dolls, not a big deal, no need to cry. He sighed softly, then pulled her to sit on the couch, furrowing his brows. How could you be so careless? Your foot is scratched. Leave me alone. Cleaning up the ceramic shards like a maid, Eileen sat on the couch, furrowing her brows, tears welling up in her eyes, looking helpless and pitiful. Sister, I didn't mean to, She spoke with shaking hands, unable to finish a sentence before bursting into tears, as if recalling something deeply saddening. Seeing this, I said nothing and went to the balcony to fetch a cigarette. Eileen always called me sister. While Henry was cooking in the kitchen, Eileen and I sat in the living room, with her addressing me as sister, inquiring about the details of Henry and my life over the years. I corrected her. I am married to Henry, so we are family now. Without a word, she picked up a cat-shaped pillow from the sofa, smiling at me in amazement. Sister, look at this. I gave this to brother Henry before I went abroad. Never thought it would still be here. My brows furrowed instantly, and my stomach churned. I held the cigarette in my hand, but did not light it. Henry disliked women who smoked. The type he liked has always been like Eileen: black hair, white dress, clean and fragile. Perhaps I had been standing on the balcony for too long, as Henry came up to me, taking the cigarette from my hand. Don't smoke, it's not good for you. I didn't intend to smoke anyway. I was pregnant, couldn't smoke. He didn't know yet. What about your sister? I asked him. He gestured towards the room. She's asleep in there. I persisted. Don't you need to keep her company? What? He was taken aback. I chuckled and asked him how long Eileen would be staying with us. Looking at him, I made a rare confession. Henry, I don't like your sister. You know, when I was pursuing you back then, there was a time when you got drunk, hugged me, and kept calling out for Eileen. At that time, I didn't know who you were calling, but now, do you really just see her as a sister? Henry, ask her to leave. She leaves, or I will, you choose. Henry looked at me for a long time, with a complex expression, then sighed deeply. Haley, what happened just now? Eileen didn't mean it. She has depression. Her emotions are not very stable. Can you understand her a bit? I know this request is unfair to you, but Eileen's parents, including Eileen herself, have been kind to me. Bringing her to our home was not for any other reason. The past is in the past. Now I truly see her as just a sister. I have you, don't I? Henry made me believe him. I looked at him, reminiscing about many things. We met in high school, Henry and I. In high school, Henry was very good looking and a good student, but not very likable, because he was too reclusive. He would always sit in the back row of the classroom, leaning against the wall. It was the darkest spot in the whole classroom. When he sat there, it became even darker, as if no light could penetrate there. But I liked him a lot. I felt like we were very similar. Henry was transferred to my class. It was high school senior year, a crucial year, and not many students would transfer schools, but he did. Throughout that year, I never saw his parents. Of course, I never saw mine either. My parents got divorced when I was very young, and both of them didn't want me. They fought in court, and the judge ultimately granted custody to my father. Shortly after their divorce, they both started new families, and I became the extra one. I suspected that Henry's family situation must be similar to mine, or maybe even worse. After all, my father, though he neglected me, was not stingy with money. But Henry, even with the heavy workload of senior year, often worked part-time at a milk tea shop outside of school. It broke my heart. Besides, I knew that Henry was actually a very gentle person. Though he appeared aloof, there was a time when I had an argument with my father, and I was crying alone in the garden behind the school library. He passed by me without saying anything, quietly leaving a pack of tissues beside me. I remember it was dusk, with a gentle breeze. The golden sunlight shining on him made even his hair shimmer. I think that was the moment I started to like him. Later, I took the same university entrance exam as him. I started pursuing him. I did my best to treat him well. For 4 years in university, Henry rarely went home, even during holidays and breaks. he stayed at school alone. I stuck around him, insisting on celebrating festivals with him. I spent Christmas days and birthdays with him, one after another. He liked girls with long hair in white dresses, so I grew out my short hair, which I had kept for years, and wore the dresses he liked. He enjoyed home-cooked meals, saying they tasted like home, so I learned to cook them and served him. I did a lot for him, but as I did more, I realized that many things had already been done for him. There were too many traces of another girl in his life, but it didn't matter. I never gave up. If someone had done it, I did it better, even better, until no one could do it better than me. No one had treated me well in my life, so I tried my best to treat him well. I pursued him for 5 years, and finally, I got what I wanted. But now, that girl has returned. Even if you can guarantee that you only see her as a sister, what about Eileen? Can you be sure she has no other feelings for you? This time, he remained silent for a long time. Finally, he said, "No, it's over." Henry assured me that no matter what, he only sees Eileen as a younger sister. He said he had already shown her some apartments, and in a few days, when Eileen felt better, and he found a suitable place, he would send her away. I still couldn't bear to part with him. With the 8 years between us, I decided to trust him once again. For these 8 years between us, and for the child in my belly, who has yet to be born, I subconsciously placed my hand on my belly, then quickly withdrew it. Henry, it's your own words. Don't lie to me. If you deceive me, I assure you, you'll regret it. I will make you regret it. The day Eileen moved, it was cloudy. Together, Henry and I accompanied her to the new house. She had a lot of things, and it took nearly 4 hours just to clean and pack her luggage. By the time we returned, it was already raining. As soon as we got home, Henry received a phone call from her. I didn't know what was said on the other end of the line. I watched Henry hesitate for a moment before responding. He hung up the phone, walked around her former room, then grabbed an umbrella and hurried out. She had forgotten something, and I offered to take it to her. It was pouring rain outside. Should we go now? Her lost items were important and needed immediately. I nodded. Then I suggested that I go with him. He looked at me, smiled, pulled me into his arms, and kissed my cheek. Don't worry. I'll be back as soon as I deliver these things. I didn't insist any further, even though I wanted to go with him. But now I was pregnant, and I couldn't be so stubborn. I sat on the couch for a long time, poured myself a glass of warm water, let it cool down slowly, and Henry hadn't returned. I only received a message from him. "Haley, the rain is heavy now. I'll stay here for a while, and come back when it calms down. When I return, I'll bring you the cake you love the most." I stared at the message for a long time. I replied, "Okay," then stood up. Eileen's house door wasn't locked. She had left a small gap, through which I could see the warm light inside, but I didn't have the courage to push it open. The corridor was dim. Through the door, I could hear the sobbing inside. Eileen was crying. I could hear the crying in her voice. "Henry, I miss you so much. In the years that I've been abroad, I've been thinking of you every day and every night. Don't you miss me?" My hand on the door handle trembled. "Eileen, you're drunk. Let go of me. Stop messing around." Then I heard the sound of a bottle of alcohol falling to the ground. Henry seemed to push her away. "No, I'm not messing around. You were the one who said you liked me first. You were the one who said you wanted to be with me all the time. Do you still like me? You must still like me." I asked Haley, "The day you two were together, you found out about my relationship from my dad. You got mad because I was with someone else. That's why you agreed to her, right? Answer me." After a long pause, I finally heard his answer, tinged with weariness. "So what if I did? It's all in the past, me." My heart sank to the bottom of a valley in an instant. I stood there frozen, my body cold, but my heart pounding as if it wanted to jump out of my throat. Then, all the sounds in the room disappeared, except for a muffled groan. I was very familiar with that kind of groan. Back in the days, I used to love kissing Henry's neck while he was reading a book, and then, he would make that kind of groaning sound. They were kissing. To be precise, Eileen was kissing him. But what about Henry? What was his reaction, his expression like? Instinctively, I cracked open the door a little. In the warm light that hit my face, I saw Henry's stunned expression clearly, but in the next instant, he slowly closed his eyes. They were kissing in the warm light. I couldn't hold it anymore, so I covered my mouth and ran away frantically. Perhaps hearing the noise, the two inside the room separated. Henry followed me out. Haley, let me explain. Things are not what you think." Back home, Henry tried to explain to me over and over again, and I locked the bedroom door, feeling dizzy inside. He was outside trying to explain. He said it was all a misunderstanding, because Eileen was drunk and emotionally unstable. That's why he stayed there to accompany her. He said everything was a mistake, all because Eileen was drunk. The words he said to her were a misunderstanding. He just didn't want her to keep bothering him. The kiss, too. Finally, he said, "Hayley, it's all in the past. I have you now." That night, I slept alone. I tossed and turned all night, thinking. The next morning, I came out of the room early, pushed the door open, and saw Henry standing at the door. He seemed to have not slept all night, with noticeable dark circles under his eyes, and a bit of stubble on his chin, but his expression was cautious. He looked at me cautiously, like a dog afraid of angering its owner. I thought for a moment, then smiled at him. "I'm hungry. I want to drink the porridge you cook. Will you cook porridge for me?" Upon hearing me say that, Henry was puzzled for a moment, then quickly smiled. He thought I had come to my senses, forgiven him, but I hadn't. I had just given up. I thought a lot that night. I've never been someone who only remembers others' faults. On the contrary, perhaps life has been too bitter. From childhood to adulthood, I've always been good at remembering the kindness others have shown me. So when I think of Henry, I always remember the time when I had a fever, and he stayed by my bedside late at night, holding a damp towel to cool me down. I remember the day he proposed to me on the beach, under a sky full of stars, holding me and kissing me. I remember a time when, on the anniversary of his parents' passing, he held me and hoarsely said, "Hayley, I only have you. Promise me you won't leave me in this lifetime." But I also remember other things. I remember all these days he kept wavering between me and Eileen. I remember he forgot what I was allergic to, but remembered all her food preferences. I remember that although he said he loved me, his eyes were always looking at her. I remember that in these 8 years, I couldn't buy a genuine heart from him. I'm tired. I'm really tired. But I'm also unwilling. I'm unwilling that I've given so much, and got nothing in return. I'm unwilling that once I leave, they can live happily ever after. Closing my eyes heavily, I decided that even if I left, Henry couldn't be unencumbered and be with Eileen. In the following days, Henry was very good to me, even considerate. He would go out of his way to buy the cakes I liked, buy the latest handbags to make amends, and kiss my cheek every morning before leaving. He started going to work on time, spending more time with me. But I also saw in Eileen's social media that he was buying her medicine, cooking for her, celebrating her birthday. Her last Instagram post was a series of 2 photos. One was of her and him many years ago, their faces young and full of genuine and warm smiles. The other was a selfie. In the photo, Eileen was holding a bouquet of roses, with a sweet smile, and behind her, a man in an apron was busy in the kitchen. The caption read, "Time flies, but we, just like in the past." Anybody who saw such photos and captions would assume they were a loving and newlywed couple. I glanced at it, then gave it a like. After a while, I received a call from Henry. "Hayley, have you finished work? Let me pick you up for dinner." "Sure, let's go have some Western food." I happily agreed, though deep down I thought, he is really busy. Busy taking care of me and busy being with her. Reluctant to leave me, yet unable to let go of her. I pretended to know nothing, playing the role of a good wife who trusted him wholeheartedly. One evening, I distinctly heard Eileen calling him, and I simply asked, "Is that Eileen?" At that time, he was lying next to me, half asleep as he answered the call, his mind still groggy. "Yes, she has a cold and a headache." He spoke, then suddenly paused. "Hayley, I smiled and interjected, "Then go and see her. Just remember to come back early." That night, Henry did not leave. He said they had medicine at her place, and she had taken it and would be fine after a good night's sleep. After his words, he turned to look at me. His expression, how can I describe it? A mix of disbelief and hesitation. He hesitated for a long time, and finally blurted out, "Why?" "What why?" I acted clueless. "In the middle of the night, you want me to deliver medicine to another woman." So he also knew it was not right. I smiled lightly and softly said, "After all, she is your sister, isn't she?" "Henry, I have thought it over. I should trust you. People have to look forward, right? Let the past be the past." That night, Henry and I had a long conversation. I was never someone who liked to act coquettish or vulnerable. I always liked to appear strong. But that night, I imitated Eileen, trying to show vulnerability to him, deliberately magnify my pain, pretend to be fragile, and then told him, "Henry, I only have you. If I can't even trust you, who can I trust? You promised that you would be good to me for a lifetime. You won't let down my trust, will you?" I knew his temperament. I knew that by doing so, he would pity me and feel guilty. A man's guilt is always more reliable than love. But that alone was not enough, far from it. I slowly placed my hand on my abdomen, feeling a twisted sense of satisfaction in my heart. There was satisfaction, but more so, there was pain. I had longed so much for the arrival of this child. Both Henry and I loved children. Perhaps due to our broken families, we both hoped to have a child of our own bloodline. Not long after we got married, we once had a misunderstanding. That time, Due to an incorrect method of pregnancy test, I thought I was pregnant. When I told him this news, I could never forget his reaction. He seemed stunned by a huge surprise, dazed for a while before coming to his senses, his eyes shining. He was not someone to openly show emotions, but at that moment, he couldn't contain his smile. He excitedly lifted me up, quickly and cautiously put me down, his face filled with regret and worry. He was afraid his actions would harm me and the child in my belly. This time, when I found out I was really pregnant, I was also excited, eager to tell him. But for some reason, that night, I saw his absent-minded look and inexplicably didn't speak. And now, as I touched my belly, all I thought was, what if Henry knew I had a child? If he knew, and if it was him who caused the child's death, or worse, if the child was lost due to him and Eileen, what would he do? I must be going crazy. I was like those evil antagonists in TV dramas, using a child as a bargaining chip. But I just couldn't help it. He loved children so much. He had so longed for a child with me. We even had a name ready for the child. If that were the case, he wouldn't be able to be with Eileen without any guilt, right? In another 10 days, it would be the 2nd anniversary of my marriage to Henry. On that day, Henry took me on a trip to celebrate. I don't know why, but as soon as we reached the destination, I started feeling unwell. Even though this child had been so obedient in my womb, since I got pregnant, there had never been any discomfort. At night, with my eyes closed, I lay on the bed, unable to sleep no matter what. Henry was lying beside me, fast asleep. The night was deep and silent, enhancing every sound. I heard the vibration of a cell phone. It was Eileen calling. Again, Henry picked up, said a few words, then hung up. The phone vibrated again and again. On the other end, I could hear Eileen crying, "Henry, can you come see me? I feel so unwell. I think I'm going to die. Nobody loves me. You don't want me either, do you? I'm standing on the rooftop right now. The wind is so strong, the sky is so dark. Will you come and see me?" Finally, Henry massaged his forehead and sighed softly. I continued lying on the bed, pretending to be asleep, until he nudged me awake. He kissed my cheek. "Haley, there's some trouble at work. I need to go back for a bit. I'll be back tomorrow morning." Normally, I would have nodded obediently, playing the gentle and accommodating role I had portrayed in these days, believing everything he said without question. But for some reason, my heart kept pounding. I acted as if I had a nightmare and clung to his waist. I even managed to shed a few tears. "Henry, please don't leave. I just had a bad dream. Don't leave me alone here." But Henry still left. He patted my head, asking me to be good and wait for him to return. Little did I know he wouldn't come back. At 2 a.m., an earthquake struck here. The house collapsed. I was buried in the rubble. What was it like being buried in the rubble? Dark. Endless darkness. The air was limited. The space was limited. Only darkness, which was infinite. Infinite darkness magnifies all the weaknesses and darkness within a person. I thought I had completely given up on Henry, completely disappointed in him. I thought I was strong, but I wasn't. When I was trapped in the rubble, unable to move, I realized I was still weak. In the darkness, I texted Henry, "Henry, there's been an earthquake. I'm buried underground. It's so dark. I'm so scared. Am I going to die? I don't want to die." In those 4 hours, I sent him many messages, from fear in the beginning, to numbness in the middle, to bitter hate later on. During those 4 hours, I even received messages of comfort from my friends, but Henry never replied. I couldn't help but wonder what he was doing during that time. While I was trapped in the rubble, was he at Eileen's house, or perhaps in her bed, whispering sweet nothings to her? The thought made me tremble uncontrollably. I was buried in the rubble for 10 hours. When I was rescued, I suddenly had another idea. I sent him 2 final texts, trembling, then threw my phone into the rubble. "Henry, I can't hold on anymore. Luckily, you have work to do, or you would have died here with me and our child. You're really lucky to be safe." It was deliberate. I wanted him to think I had died in the rubble. I wanted him to feel guilty, to regret. I wanted him to remember. It was him who suggested, who brought me here. It was him who left me here alone for his Eileen, letting me and my child die in a foreign land. And even at the brink of death, my heart and mind were full of him, worrying and celebrating for him. I wanted him to be haunted by memories, surrounded by shadows of me. I wanted him to feel guilty, unable to sleep at night. By the time Henry received those messages, it was already broad daylight. The previous night, when he found Eileen, she was standing on the rooftop, the wind threatening to blow her over. She turned, looked at him, and gave a faint smile. "Henry, you're back. I knew you'd still have me in your heart." For some reason, seeing this scene, he felt a hint of weariness. Of course, mostly, it was heartache. That night, Eileen held him, repeatedly recounting her grievances. At this point, he couldn't quite understand his own feelings. Did he still love Eileen? It seemed not as much. He knew he loved Hayley. 8 years together made her not just a lover, but also family. Though she was the one who initially pursued him, who first fell for him. But over these 8 years, he couldn't bear to leave her. Towards Eileen, he felt only reluctance. He just felt sorry for her. She was his lover from his youth, the one he couldn't forget, the one he couldn't touch. Back then, everyone was against them, and now, he knew he should push her away, but he didn't. He just patted her head, telling her not to overthink. Did you take your medicine today? Is there any discomfort anywhere? I'll take you to see a doctor. He told himself, it's okay. He was just taking care of a patient. He was just taking care of his sister. Hayley didn't know anything. Hayley loved him so much. Just this once, the last time, when he woke up in the morning, the sky was already bright. He was woken up by the alarm clock. Subconsciously reached for his phone, only to find his scheduled flight was cancelled. Then came a barrage of message notifications. Finally, he saw Hayley's text messages, one after another. She said there had been an earthquake. She was buried underground. It was so dark. She was so scared. For a moment, he felt like he was plunged into an ice cellar. Even the hand holding the phone began to tremble. He told himself, it's impossible, it's impossible. None of this was real. But the overwhelming push notifications on his phone made it clear to him that all of this was indeed real. He frantically called Hayley, but the call was never answered. He texted her again, but still, there was no response. He started to feel scared. Fear swept over him like a hurricane. Perhaps because his face looked so pale, Eileen walked over to him and asked, Henry, what's wrong? Looking at her face, which was as unchanged as usual, he suddenly remembered the night before. Last night, at 2 in the morning, while Hayley was trapped under the rubble, what was he doing? His face darkened even more. He hastily grabbed his coat from the sofa and headed out. Henry, where are you going? He seemed to hear Eileen's voice, yet at the same time he didn't. He just walked straight ahead, his steps unsteady. He didn't know where he was going. Where could he go? All flights to that area were cancelled. The roads had collapsed. He couldn't get to her. He couldn't go anywhere. Henry finally returned home, back to the home he had shared with Hayley for 3 years. He held the phone numbly, refreshing it constantly, hoping to receive a message from Hayley, but none came. He waited for 5 hours, and finally, he received 2 very short text messages from Hayley. Henry, I can't hold on anymore. It's lucky that you still have work to keep you busy. Otherwise you would have died here with me and the child. You're really fortunate to be safe. His heart exploded. A child. He and Hayley had a child. He suddenly remembered a few days ago, when Hayley took a package full of children's clothes and toys. At that time, he was puzzled. He asked her why she bought these. She just smiled and told him that a friend of hers was pregnant, so she wanted to get her some gifts. Back then, holding her, he had eagerly asked, Hayley, when will we have our own child? And she blushed and smiled shyly. She looked at him and asked very seriously, Henry, if we have our own child one day, will you be a good husband and father? Of course I will. I will take care of you well. I will do better than anyone else, and I will never let you down. Memories flooded back in an instant. He went mad searching for those things, only to discover that the house was filled with traces of Hayley. On the fridge was a weekly meal plan arranged by Hayley in elegant handwriting on a small chalkboard. In the closet, all the clothes were neatly organized, and even in his study, on his desk, there were cards she had written for him. It's been an hour of work. Time to take a break. Remember to drink water. Why had he never noticed these things before? Why had he always taken these things for granted? He searched for a long time. Finally, in a drawer in the room, he found those things. Apart from the children's clothes and toys, he also found a very old and thick sketchbook. He knew Hayley liked to draw, but he didn't know that she had secretly drawn so many portraits of him, one after another, from their first meeting in high school, to getting to know each other, falling in love, and getting married. She had recorded every moment with her brush. The earliest drawing was already very old, showing him reading a book in the classroom during high school. She had written beside it, "The person I fell in love with at first sight." The second drawing depicted the beginning of their acquaintance. He discreetly handed a pack of tissues to a girl crying in the garden. She wrote, "He really is a very gentle person." The third drawing puzzled him for a while, as he couldn't recall when he had looked like that. It was only after reading the accompanying text that he guessed it must have been drawn during their first Chinese New Year celebration together. She had written, "It turns out he, like me, has no home to return to. I really feel so sorry for him. From now on, I will spend every Christmas with him. Although he seems not to need my company, Having someone by your side is always a little better, right? He continued flipping through. Finally, he found the portrait of them together. There were no people in the portrait, only two well-crafted ceramic dolls. She had written beside it, "Our token of love." Although he never told me he liked me, we made ceramic dolls for each other, and he would smile as he looked at the dolls. This should also be considered a form of mutual understanding, right? I will keep this pair of ceramic dolls safe. When we get married in the future, have children, and when our teeth are old, I will still take out this pair of ceramic dolls, show them to our grandchildren, and tell them the story of their grandparents. When he read this, he took a sharp breath, and subconsciously went to the living room to find that pair of ceramic dolls. But when he arrived at the display cabinet, he suddenly remembered that the pair of ceramic dolls had already been broken. His outstretched hand grasped at emptiness. Eventually, he collapsed on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. After the earthquake, that place was closed for a total of 7 days. During these days, Henry did a lot of things. He sent her many messages and made many phone calls. He even reported her missing to the police. He searched for everyone related to her, but he never got any information about her. He even went to her parents, but they had no idea of what happened to her on that side. He refused to believe that his Haley was dead. Every night, he locked himself in his room. He dared not go anywhere, as every corner of the house was filled with traces of Haley. He would think of her when he saw the paintings on the wall, the decorations on the table, the warm yellow cushions on the sofa, and the flowers on the bedside. There were so many memories between them. She loved him so much, and he loved her too. But why did things turn out this way? On the 6th night, the flowers on the bedside were left uncared for and had started to wither. He was the same. He lay in bed, flipping through the photo album she left behind and the messages she sent him while buried underground. He wondered, what kind of emotions did she have while being buried underground? She loved him so much. Her love for him was always intense and passionate, but he had deceived her, and he left her all alone there. Being buried underground all alone, she must have felt hopeless and scared, right? Yet she told him, "It's so good that you're okay." He closed his eyes tightly, his hand slowly moving towards his neck. It must have been so dark there. Dark and gloomy, without light, with limited air. What would it feel like to not be able to breathe? His hand exerted more pressure gradually. Would it feel similar to this? He opened his mouth like a fish on the verge of death, gasping for air, but his hand did not relax at all. However, in the next moment, he released the pressure. He couldn't die. He had to go find her. Even in death, he should be with her in the same place. The next time I saw Henry was on the 7th day after the earthquake. On the 7th day after the earthquake, the roads were finally cleared, and flights resumed. I hid in the tent, watching him holding my photo, looking for me everywhere. He had already asked the person in charge here, but there was no news of me there. How could there be news of me? I just didn't want him to find me. After being rescued, I lied that I didn't have my phone or ID with me. When they were gathering information, I gave my friend's name and ID number. I didn't know how long I could hide from him, but for now, I would hide for as long as I could. I took one last look at his frantic figure, and slowly got into my friend's car. He seemed worn out, with stubble and uncut hair. But what did that have to do with me? He deserved all this. I hid in my friend's house for a week, and finally went out. I went to the hospital for an abortion. When Henry found me, I had already had the operation, and was lying on the hospital bed. He looked at me, his eyes suddenly red. "Haley." I didn't say anything and silently took out the divorce agreement that I had prepared. "Let's get a divorce." Henry refused to sign. I asked him just one question. "Henry, what were you doing on the night of the earthquake at 2:30 in the morning when I was buried under the rubble?" "I knew everything." "Sign it. You don't deserve my true feelings at all." He was stunned for a moment, his face as pale as paper, but he still refused to sign. Perhaps he also understood that between us, the feelings had drained away, and there was no child anymore. This thin, flimsy piece of paper, with 2 names on the marriage certificate, was our final connection. He forced a grin, but his body was trembling. "Haley, let's go home. You've just had the operation. Let me take care of you." Lucy pushed him away. Lucy was my friend who came to pick me up after the earthquake, and I had been staying at her house these days. "Do you have any shame at all? Haley has made it so clear. Don't you know what you've done? How dare you say anything about taking care of you? Well, I don't need you to take care of me. I will take good care of Haley." He asked me again how he could be forgiven. "Haley, I know I was wrong. I will change. Will you forgive me? Will you give me another chance?" "Another chance? I've given it to you. I've given it to you already. I asked you. I believed in you. but what about you? He couldn't say a word. He brought out the album. Veins popped out on his hand as he clenched the album. After hesitating for a while, he finally blurted out, but Hailey, you love me, right? No one will ever love him like she did. If you love me so much, how could you suddenly stop loving me? He could actually ask such a question. I looked at him intently, with no more ripples in my heart. I smiled lightly, snatched the album from him, and tore it to pieces. Henry, I loved you, but that was in the past. I loved you, but who wouldn't be better to love than you? Every stroke and line on this book is my true feelings, but you don't deserve to keep my true feelings. In the days that followed, Henry came to see me every day. Every time he would bring the soup he cooked, then knock on Lucy's door. And Lucy, every time in front of him, poured the soup down the trash can, and then drove him away. A week later, Lucy was fed up. She called the police to drive Henry away. So after that, Henry waited for me at the gate of the community every day. He waited for me for over half a month. During this half a month, he quit his job, and even Eileen was abandoned. And I never went downstairs to see him. On the day half a month later, it was my birthday. That day, Henry bought a birthday cake, called me, hoping I would come to see him. On the phone, he said he would wait for me until I went to see him. I didn't say anything and hung up the phone. I still didn't go to see him. That night, it was pouring rain. Early the next morning, I received a call from Eileen. She told me Henry had a high fever and was lying in the hospital. She begged me to come to the hospital to see him. I still didn't say anything and hung up the phone, but I still went to the hospital. The smell of disinfectant was strong in the hospital. Henry saw me and his eyes lit up immediately. I looked at him, then at the equally haggard Eileen beside him, and directly slapped them each. What are you doing? It was Eileen who spoke. She spoke, about to push me, but I pushed her to the ground first. I gave her another slap, splashing the water on the table onto her face. I looked at her steadily, one word at a time. What? Shouldn't you be hit? You should be grateful that I can't be bothered to argue with you now, or I would have made your affairs public a long time ago. Don't you have depression? Can't you live without your Henry? Now, your Henry doesn't want you. Why haven't you died yet? Or is your diagnosis report completely fake? She was struck by my accuracy, turned pale, and dared not speak. I was too lazy to look at her again. While we were arguing, Henry just watched me quietly all the time. It was as if he completely ignored that I had slapped Eileen. He didn't say a word, and when I turned to look at him, he carefully tugged on my sleeve, his eyes red, looking hopeful. Hailey, I pulled my sleeve out silently, frowned, and said slowly, Henry, you really disgust me like this. He stammered, I just feel guilty. I want to make it up to you. I laughed out loud, and once again, threw the divorce agreement in front of him. Want to make it up to me? You're just self-pitying. I've said it before, in this life, the next life, I don't want to see you again. Do you understand? No matter what you do, I can never forgive you. Even if you're lying in the hospital dying now, I just feel disgusted. If you really feel guilty, then sign the papers. The light in his eyes finally extinguished. In the end, Henry signed the divorce agreement. I also moved out of Lucy's house. I changed cities, moved to a new home, and started a new life. For the next few years, I didn't see Henry again. However, every Christmas, I would receive some inexplicable packages, filled with various jewelry and luxury goods. I returned them all. One time, I received a pair of ceramic dolls that looked almost identical to the ones Eileen had shattered before. I smashed the dolls and sent them back. 3 years after the divorce, my career made a major breakthrough, and I met someone new. We met at work. Shortly after getting to know each other, we found that we got along very well, and we naturally started dating. He was a very gentle person, completely different from Henry. He didn't have any messy ex-girlfriends. Since we started dating, he often talked about me. People around him also knew that he was henpecked. He rarely drank, and would consciously keep a distance from female friends. Even on social occasions, he would return home on time, because his girlfriend has him on a short leash. He said, Hailey, I am your boyfriend. I have an obligation to control myself well and give you enough sense of security. Let's continue our relationship naturally and get married. Shortly after getting married, I heard that Henry was not doing well. After your divorce, he was quite depressed, numbing himself with alcohol every day, and had been to the hospital several times. On the day you got married, he drank until he had stomach bleeding. That white moonlight of his has always been by his side, but unfortunately Henry didn't want her company. I heard that she seems to be depressed now for real. A few days later, I received a letter. There was no signature, but as soon as I saw the handwriting, I knew it was from Henry. I didn't open it, just tore it up and threw it in the trash. After so many years, I had already moved on to a new life, and I didn't want to know what else he had to say to me.